The Harley-Davidson Sportster emerged as a mere also-ran in 1957, but by 1966 the XL-CH had become the fastest and one of the most powerful production motorcycles in the world, with a top speed of 122 miles per hour. In October 1971, the hallowed Sportster engine, massively modified, entered the Guinness Book of Records with the motorcycle land speed record of 265 miles per hour. Thus, the Harley-Davidson Sportster XL had been developed into the greatest motorcycle in the world. The sport in Sportster was completely fulfilled, and the Sportster XL's identity firmly established. Until 1969, when Soichiro Honda released the world's first superbike, the CB750. It cost $1,495 in America, when the cheapest Sportster cost $1,698. In that first year, the CB750 saw sales exceed 50,000 units worldwide, where the two Sportster models sold just 7,800. The problem at this point was that Harley's excellent pace of engine development just stopped dead. Between 1966 and 1969, even the most optimistic figures say that the XL engine power only increased from 55 to 58 horsepower. To make matters worse, in 1972, Kawasaki's response to the Honda CB750 was the all-conquering, most glorious Z1 or Z900. It offered a staggering 81 horsepower, which completely overshadowed the Honda with 67 horsepower. Harley responded by increasing the Sportster XL engine size from 883cc to 1000cc, but even this only increased horsepower to about 61. At the end of 1976, Suzuki entered the superbike era with a superb GS750 and a year later the GS1000. All these gorgeous creations from the Far East were supremely good with modern overhead cam aluminium engines. Thus, the new Japanese superbikes were cheap, fast, light, smooth, powerful, reliable, better handling and very modern. In short, the Japanese bikes were modern sports bikes, where many saw the Sportster as an old-fashioned, comparatively ponderous design of motorcycle. The Sportster XL represented a huge proportion of the total Harley-Davidson sales. At times, as much as 20% of the motor company's total bike sales were Sportsters. This meant that Willie G. Davidson and his design team were faced with a tricky problem of how to respond to the Japanese motorcycle invasion. Back in the 50s, Harley-Davidson had a similar problem with the British. Triumph, BSA and Norton, among others, were outselling Harley because their bikes were better and cheaper. Harley's answer in 1952 was the Model K. It was touted as a sports bike, but it wasn't genuinely sporty at all. With a reworked engine, the Model K was superseded by the Sportster XL in 1957, but it wasn't really sporty either, although the engine was incredibly strong. Between 1957 and 1966, the engine was developed until the original 40 horsepower XL became the awesome 55 horsepower XL-CH of 1966. While this may not make the Sportster a sports bike per se, it did mean that nothing could touch it from a standing start or in a straight line. The 1970s saw all this count for naught though. A piffling 61 horsepower from a 1000cc engine in 1972 was not even vaguely impressive, so Willie G's problem was one of identity. If the sport in Sportster had become a misnomer, what was a 1970s Sportster XL? What should the name Sportster evoke now? To establish a new Sportster XL identity, a significant period of transition would inevitably be required, and Willie G began this in 1970. But, as we've seen, he got it wrong. The infamous boat-tail design option for the rear of the Sportster seat and the Superglide was not at all popular and was dropped years later. Between 1972 and the Annus Horribilis of 1974, the cylinder bore was increased to 1000cc and the ever-popular Bendix Zenith carburetor was introduced, as was the hydraulic front disc brake. By the early 1970s, motorcycle fashions had changed, and one of these was the demise of the traditional single seat. Perhaps because the Japanese marques all offered dual seats, everyone else followed, including Harley-Davidson. The Sportster was now equipped with a banana seat, which had much less padding so was correspondingly less comfortable. The seat closely followed the contours of the frame and mudguard, custom style, so it looked kinda cool, but must have hurt on long rides. That's fashion, I suppose. These changes were mostly minor developmental improvements, but would have been most welcome nonetheless. The enforced changes in 1975, however, were less exciting. Environmental issues were becoming more serious, so engine emissions and fuel were being placed under tighter scrutiny. Along with such innovations as lead-free petrol and catalytic converters, in the USA, the government dictated that all motorcycles should have a foot-operated gear shifter on the left of the bike, and that sequence should be 1 down, 3 up, depending on the number of gears. Unfortunately for us in Great Britain, we use right-hand gear shifters. Since the original Model K and the later Sportster were both designed to combat the British motorcycle invasion, these too had right-hand side foot shifters. Triumph simply drilled an ugly, very Heath Robinson hole through the engine cases to move the gear shifter from right to left, and Harley chose a slightly less ugly Heath Robinson linkage to move the gear shifter. After the hand gear stick was deleted, the big V twin Harley-Davidson FL Touring and FX cruising bikes had always had foot shifters on the left. Thus, the middle years of the 1970s were somewhat unremarkable for the Harley-Davidson Sportster XL. For the United States, 1976 was the bicentennial, marking the 200th year since they chose to throw off our wise and benevolent British authority. For many decades, Harley-Davidson have produced special anniversary models every 5 years, each bike issued in limited numbers with glitzy paint. Although 1976 was no specific Harley-Davidson anniversary, the US bicentennial was certainly worth celebrating, especially for a company that has always been the epitome of Americana. Centenary bikes, known as Liberty Editions, were released for most models, although there was nothing different underneath the paintwork. The 1976 Sportsters did away with the popular Bendix carburetor in favour of the new Kaihin butterfly carburetor, variations of which were fitted to all models until 1990. In Britain, those of us of a certain age will forever remember the long hot summer of 1976. We had blistering temperatures across the board, wall-to-wall sunshine, water shortages so severe that domestic supplies were cut off, which required that standpipes were put up on street corners.
When rationing began only 3 weeks ago, the South West Water Authority forecast it would last for several months. It would end only when the almost empty reservoirs were half full again. Well, earlier this week they were installing scores of additional standpipes in streets throughout Devon.
I can still remember the polite conversation in the good-natured queues as we all stood and waited for our turn to fill whatever containers we could with cool, clear, fresh water. And to add to all that, there were huge, biblically proportioned plagues of aggressive ladybirds. Which bite? Who knew? I was at school in St Crispin's Comprehensive in Wokingham, Berkshire, when, during a hot, stuffy assembly one morning, the greatest headmaster who ever lived, Mr John Cole, announced to the whole school that immediately after this assembly, wearing a school tie would no longer be required because of the heat. 1,000 school kids all cheered at once. What a day. If the first phase of the Sportster transitional process was at best unremarkable, the second phase was not. Beginning in 1977, much more substantial changes and developments were about to impact the Harley-Davidson Sportster. By the mid-1970s, the Harley-Davidson landscape was changing significantly under AMF, and it would continue to do so throughout the 70s. Two hugely important developments in 1974 and 1975 are key for Harley-Davidson and for the Sportster XL. First, a name which is massively significant to the modern motorcycle company appears, a name in fact that is more important than any other name that does not have Harley or Davidson in it. That name is Vaughan Beals. Vaughan Beals was a rare beast indeed. He was an accomplished aeronautical engineer as well as being a successful and gifted chief executive. AMF recruited him to join Harley-Davidson in 1975 to manage and administer new engineering designs. But the Vaughan Beals legacy at Harley-Davidson multiplies exponentially as the decade ends, as we shall discover in the next episode. The second development in 1974 benefited Willie G's design department directly. Louis Netz joined the motor company. Willie G describes Netz as a colleague and a talented young designer who became my partner and friend. The Harley design dream team of Willie G and Louis Netz had a huge job on their hands, and they had limited funds with which to do it. The first design demand the team faced was the need to develop the Big V twin range, which was being hit very hard by the Japanese marques. Willie G had made an audacious, if faltering, start with the FX Superglide in 1971. By 1977, the Dream Team had developed that design into the immortal FX Lowrider. Willie G and Louis Netz took two of the new lowriders from the factory in York and rode them to Daytona that spring. Willie G describes stares, thumbs up, and contagious, enthusiastic comments at Daytona and also along the ride there. The Sportster XL, on the other hand, was in a curious state of identity limbo, which it was proving difficult to design the model out of. Willie G teamed up with Jim Halbert to create a prototype Sportster, and with Louis Netz, the 1977 Sportster XL CR was released. Willie G said that the design aimed to make a racer-looking vehicle. He also says that the design remains one of my favourites, and that he's kept and owned the first XL CR produced. But like the Boattail design of 1971, this Cafe Racer version of the Sportster was very unpopular and a commercial flop. But, unlike the Boattail Sportster, the XL CR constituted much more than just minor bodywork and paint tweaks. Alan Girdler describes the standard Sportster XL frame as woefully out of date by 1977, as it was still firmly based on the old Model K frame from 1952. So the 1977 Cafe Racer Sportster gained a newly revised frame, at least at the rear. Since 1952, all Model K and Sportster models had the rear suspension mounted halfway along the swing arm at the bottom and in front of the rear mudguard at the top. The XLCR had a much more sensible mounting system at the rear of the swing arm and above the rear mudguard, pretty much like every other bike in the world. This gave the suspension a more rigid mounting which improved handling. An added benefit was also space. Since the new rear frame moved the suspension backwards, the battery and oil tank fitted much more snugly. Before this, Sportster oil tanks blistered out quite a long way outside the frame, but the Sportster XLCR had a much cleaner, more modern look. The Cafe Racer Sportster also gained twin discs at the front and new disc brake at the rear, replacing the old drum brake. The engine cases were also redesigned to allow for a left-side gear shifter without the Heath rod linkage, and the engine itself was all black rather than bare metal. Unfortunately, the other changes were less positive, being either gimmicky or even bizarre, like the horrible Siamese exhaust, which fed two overlong pipes exiting on both sides of the bike. A new petrol tank, tailpiece and fairing were added, and the footrests were mounted further backwards with lower handlebars to emphasise the sporting illusion. The wheels were cast, not spoked, in a stereotypically 70s way, which was at odds with the otherwise old-school Cafe Racer focus. For nearly all the Sportster's life until 1977, Harley-Davidson had offered two genuine Sportster models, the XLH and the XLCH. There have been some obscure racing bikes offered, the XR models, but these are not really Sportsters at all because, as Alan Girdler notes, the Alloy XR shared almost no parts with the XL Sportster. For 1977, however, two Sportster models were deemed insufficient. The XLH and the XLCH 1000 were still offered and sold well, but in addition to the XLCR, another version was added to the lineup, the XLT Touring version. It was equipped with a plush seat, comfy enough to sit on even with a passenger, and it had higher bars, a larger petrol tank and a factory-fitted screen with hard saddlebags. Although it came with the old Sportster frame, at least the Siamese exhaust had been swapped for a handsome, baloney-cut 2-1 exhaust. Alas, the touring version sales were even lower than the Cafe Racer sales. There were also some rather bizarre special models that appeared in 1977 called the Confederate Edition bikes. Presumably, Harley were trying to tap into their inner Dukes of Hazzard, but only a few hundred bikes were sold. 1978 marked the 75th anniversary for the Harley-Davidson Motor Company. Obviously, the company offered special paint models, and the Sportster was no exception. The XLH 1000 75th anniversary model was offered at a premium price, although, like all the anniversary bikes, it was a standard XLH underneath the paint, and the cast aluminium wheels in gold. According to Sportsterpedia, 1978 also marked some significant improvements across the Sportster board, although Alan Girdler says these improvements occurred in 1979. In 78 or 79, all models were equipped with the improved frame from the ill-fated Cafe Racer. This allowed all the Sportster XLs to show off the new, clean lines around the oil tank, and all models were additionally equipped with the dual front disc brakes. Also for 1978, the four existing Sportster models, the XLH, the XLCH, the XLCR Cafe Racer, and the XLT Tourer, were supplemented with another new model, the XLS Roadster. This was aimed at riders who wanted the styling of the big cruisers like the awesome FX Low Rider, but who also wanted a more manageable platform, that is, something smaller and cheaper. Alan Girdler seems to suggest that we in Europe were especially keen on this sort of chopper image bike rather than the miniature highway hauler. Either way, the new Sportster XLS Roadster offered features like smaller rear wheels so a big fat tyre could be fitted and extended forks, all good honest chopper-esque features. Curiously, Sportsterpedia only report a sales figure of 2 for 1978, perhaps because it was aimed at being a 1979 release when sales for the XLS Roadster were over 5,000. As the decade ended, the great and unstoppable winds of change were surging through the world. I live in the Northern Hemisphere, and in the specifically Western part, so my perspective will always follow that bias. However, we must note in passing that nearly every continent of the world was struggling with horrors and injustices of their own, Africa, Asia, and South America especially. But even here in our pampered little corner of the world, there were horrors and tragedies aplenty. Throughout Europe and the Middle East in the 1970s, terrorism was a constant malignant evil. Fueled by twisted ideology and the wicked twins of poverty and injustice, those who felt they had no alternative but grotesque violence proliferated, wreaking unimaginable carnage. On top of this, in Great Britain, unemployment levels were continually breaking new records. 1 million in 1971 marked its highest level since the Second World War. By 1978 it was 1.5 million, and in 1983 it had topped 3 million, easily its highest rate since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Industrial unrest, that is, relentless strikes, were more or less continuous during the 1970s, and in addition, interest rates and inflation were sky high, which left the majority in Great Britain struggling horribly in so many ways. And if that wasn't enough, a new expression entered my consciousness back then. New as in I'd never heard it in relation to Britain before. The term was race riot. The first I was aware of was after the Notting Hill Carnival of 1976. America was also struggling with economic problems as the recession bit hard for ordinary people. The energy crisis was also keenly felt in the US. Oil prices doubled in a single year, leading to shortages severe enough to generate huge queues at filling stations. But headline news for America, following the disastrous end to the war in Vietnam in 1975, was often political. The key word here is Watergate. President Nixon had been forced to resign the previous year and was succeeded by President Gerald Ford. However, when Ford refused to prosecute Nixon and issued a presidential pardon instead, it was clear that America was being denied any sense of closure. Many Americans just couldn't stomach this injustice and put the blame firmly at President Ford's door. The end of the Ford presidency was surely sealed during the presidential election debate in 1976 when President Ford said, "There is no Soviet domination over Eastern Europe." Thus, on the 20th of January 1977, James Earl Carter was inaugurated as the 39th President of the United States. To continue with our hopelessly biased worldview, even though life was often difficult for our delicate Western souls, we humans just can't help looking for that glimmer of hope. In Great Britain, even amongst the turmoil, we found much more than a glimmer in the national joy of the 1977 Silver Jubilee. A chance once again to wave a patriotic flag and remember how special Great Britain is. In June, Queen Elizabeth II lit a massive bonfire in Windsor Great Park to begin a week-long celebration. Beacon fires on sites used by Queen Elizabeth I in 1588 from Land's End to the Shetland Isles were lighted across the land. I remember the fabled street parties when tables and chairs appeared from nowhere in long lines down the centre of many roads. Friends and neighbours got together, bringing whatever delicacy, or junk food, they could, and, in a most un-British-like fashion, joined together in communal fun, frivolity and celebration. In 1977, I was suffering my first thoroughly dreadful bout of serious depression. I didn't go to any street parties. In America, as we've seen, 1976 was the bicentennial, which marked a year of celebration and, perhaps, optimism as the country began to move away from Watergate and the American War in Vietnam. 3 years later, President Carter signed the SALT II agreement with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev on the 18th of June 1979. The negotiations for the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, began in 1969 and SALT II in 1972. Today, I don't think it's appreciated how important an agreement to limit nuclear weapons was in the 1970s. I grew up under the constant nuclear fear, which proliferated much gallows humour, but the miserable realities of duck and cover or the nonsense of protect and survive all marked a real threat that we each had to live with every day. Many Brits of my age will remember our teachers telling us how we should hide under our desks if the fabled 3-minute warning ever sounded. We all took it very seriously, and presumably we believed that our school desks were all radiation-proof. It meant that any news that helped prevent mutually assured destruction was indeed most welcome, certainly a source for some optimism. Optimism, unfortunately, is not a recognised currency, which makes it useless if you want to buy a motorcycle. Money to buy said motorbike, and the fuel to ride it, are all required, and in our little corner of the globe, both were difficult to get throughout the 1970s. This meant that obviously sales slumped. For the Harley-Davidson Sportster XL, the high point of 1974, when nearly 24,000 bikes were sold, seemed like a very distant memory by 1982, when less than 8,000 Sportsters were sold. Perhaps the most bizarre aspect of this reality is that this was exactly the time when AMF were pushing Harley-Davidson hard to increase production. It wasn't just Harley-Davidson, though, who were fighting to sell more bikes to, apparently, fewer customers. The big Japanese manufacturers were also awash with excess stock they needed to clear, but unlike Harley, the Japanese manufacturers could afford to sell at least some models at a loss. Thus, many more motorcycles were available to buy from all manufacturers, which meant reducing prices, something the Japanese could afford to do, but Harley-Davidson really could not. The motor company tried to get the government to impose a tax on US imports to balance the playing field, so to speak, but they failed. This meant some great bargains were available for those motorcycle buyers who could afford to spend. With such a clear decline in sales, the obvious question is, how could a very cost-conscious AMF justify pushing Harley-Davidson to produce more and more for a greatly shrinking market? The answer began to reveal itself during World War II, obviously. The most numerous wartime motorcycle was the BSA M30, which was a single-cylinder 500cc side-valve bike. It's said that about 126,000 bikes saw active service. The second most numerous model must have been the ubiquitous Harley-Davidson WLA. Estimates vary, but it seems that more than 70,000 bikes saw service because, most importantly, it seems that virtually every Allied military service saw something of this motorcycle. This allowed the Harley brand to proliferate across the world without any real need for marketing or a distribution network, or even dealerships, as military units generally maintain their own equipment. Thus, almost everyone was familiar with the Harley-Davidson brand to some degree. After the war, though, for some reason, the international market became invisible to the Harley and the Davidson clan. All their efforts went into selling motorcycles in North America. The rest of the world just didn't register. This caused terrible problems for the motor company because, as the 1950s blended into the 1960s, British motorcycle companies like BSA, Norton and especially Triumph dominated the US market. By the mid-1960s, total Harley-Davidson sales had slumped to an unbelievably low 10,000 units. Compare that to 1974, when the Sportster alone sold nearly 24,000. As I've mentioned many times, up until the early 1970s, there was only one Harley-Davidson dealer in all of Europe, and that was the late, great Fred Waugh in London. But even then, Fred's sales were not new models. Waugh's made its living refurbishing and selling, in particular, wartime WLA models, perhaps with some retired US police models from the 1950s and 60s too. But, as Fred noted, new Harley-Davidsons were far beyond the financial reach of ordinary British riders. It's easy to criticise a family's narrow-minded worldview, not least because Harley-Davidson are a big global company today. Also, some foreign markets have always been very strong for Harley-Davidson. Europe, obviously, has a good Harley following, but so have Australia and Japan. It seems almost crazy to ignore such potentially lucrative opportunities. The motor company simply could not function in such a narrow market, so in 1969 they avoided bankruptcy only by selling to AMF. American Machine and Foundry were not so insular. They were certainly an international company and would never stand for avoiding the whole of the wider world. Quite the opposite, in fact. With collapsing sales in North America, AMF saw the growth potential of Harley-Davidson in selling their wares across the world. Unfortunately, I've no information about how the Harley-Davidson International Dealership Network developed. I'd love to know when and how Harley spread across mainland Europe and Australia, for instance. While Europe had sported only one Harley dealer since the war, by the end of the 1970s, the number of Harley-Davidson dealerships in Britain exploded exponentially, going from just one, to three. Yes, 3. I know it's not a large number, it's small, but bear with me. Look, you're missing the point here. 3 isn't many, but the point is that 3 is more than 1. It does show that finally things were going in the right direction for Harley-Davidson internationally. By 1984, the number of dealerships increased again to 4, but most importantly, 2 of those 4 dealers are still thriving today. Wars in London obviously, but also Riders in Bridgewater, my local dealership. Riders was started in 1976 by Phil Jessup, who sold second-hand bikes from a shed in his garden. I've long wanted to write the history of Riders, especially as their 40th anniversary as an official Harley-Davidson dealership comes up next year, and I spoke to Mr. Jessup Sr. He talked with great nostalgia about his family's sporting traditions and the Monmouth Street shop where, he said, he knocked 3 shop units into one to make the dealership. This is where I first found Riders when I moved to the West Country in 1985. Riders has always been a multi-brand dealership. Nowadays, that's Harley-Davidson and Ducati, but back in the day, it was Harley and Kawasaki, and I clearly remember a lovely GPZ 750 that took my eye. It was £2,000. Alas, Social Security payments don't increase to cover higher purchase payments for a motorcycle, which is a shame, but you can understand why. Today, Riders operates from a large dealership on the other side of town, and 20 years ago, Riders in Bristol opened. There's also the curious case of the disappearing Riders in Cardiff, which no one at Riders ever talks about. Mr. Jessup Sr. put me onto his son Martin, who, now that he's stopped riding motorcycles on the streets at crazy speeds in various TT races, is second in command at Riders. Martin was keen on me writing Riders' history, but alas, Mr. Jessup Sr. was taken ill at the time, and it was several weeks before he returned to work. With the demands of his job greatly increased, Martin said we'd have to put the project on hold indefinitely. The early 1970s saw the first phase of the Sportster XL's transition, which was, as we've noted, somewhat underwhelming. A second transitional phase, which may be said to have begun in 1977 with the ill-fated Cafe Racer, continued into the mid-1980s even as sales declined. The surprising plethora of 5 Sportster models in 1978 was reduced to 3 for 1979, as the poorly selling XLCR Cafe Racer and the even poorer selling XLT Tourer were both dropped from the range. This left the ubiquitous XLH and XLCH with a new XLS Roadster. But, alas, the Halo CH moniker, C for competition and H for high compression engine, was about to disappear because, as we've noted previously, there really was no significant differences between the H and the CH by now. So the 1980 Sportster XL lineup consisted of just 2 models, the XLH 1000 and the XLS 1000 Roadster. There were several technical upgrades, including a fully electronic ignition system which eliminated the mechanical malarkey controlling the spark advance, but nothing very significant. 1981 was a momentous and perilous year for Harley-Davidson and the management team, though, headed by Vaughan Beals. Although significant changes for the Sportster were still a few years away, the motor company was once again on the brink with almost unimaginable changes set to shake the very fabric of the company. For some years, Harley-Davidson's survival would be set on a knife edge, more precarious than the AMF year and even more challenging than the Great Depression of the 1930s, because very nearly half the workforce was laid off. Join me next time to find out how Team Vaughan Beals manages to salvage the Harley finances from a near mortal catastrophe to actual profitable success, proclaiming loudly that the eagle soars alone.